Hey there, welcome back to Red Moon Diaries. Today we have more scary stories for you guys. Let me know your favorite one in the comments below.
I haven't stepped foot inside a forest in 4 years. Not a national park, not a state reserve, not even the wooded trails behind my apartment complex. People tell me I'm missing out on the beauty of nature. They talk about the peace of the wilderness, the quiet of the mountains. They don't understand that the quiet is exactly what terrifies me. Because when you are miles away from civilization, surrounded by ancient pines and suffocating darkness, the quiet is never actually empty. It's just waiting. 4 years ago, I took a seasonal job as a maintenance worker and stable hand at a place I'll call Timberline Outpost. It was an isolated, historic lodge nestled deep within the cavernous valleys of the Black Ridge Basin. A massive, sprawling national park dominated by jagged peaks, abandoned silver mining trails, and hundreds of miles of dense, unforgiving backcountry.
Timberline wasn't like the modern tourist centers at the front of the park. It was originally built in 1884 by a man named Silas Vance. Silas was a relic of a violent era, a former trapper, failed prospector, and notoriously eccentric frontiersman who carved the lodge out of the wilderness with his own hands. According to the park brochures, Silas was a charming rogue who hosted stagecoaches, brewed his own vicious moonshine called Black Ridge Rot, and entertained wealthy East Coast tourists with tall tales until he died of a wasting fever in the winter of 1906. The brochures made him sound like a colorful local legend. The staff treated him like a mascot. Whenever a wrench went missing from the maintenance shed or a door blew shut on its own, the older employees would just laugh and say, "Old Silas is getting restless."
I thought it was funny at first. A harmless ghost story to pass the time when the internet went down and the fog rolled in so thick you couldn't see the trees 50 feet from the porch. The first month was fine. The work was exhausting, but the isolation was exactly what I thought I needed. But as summer faded into the bitter, wet chill of autumn, the atmosphere in the valley began to change. The days grew shorter, the shadows stretched longer across the canyon floor, and the things we blamed on old Silas stopped feeling like innocent coincidences. It started with the smell.
I'd be doing nighttime rounds, checking the locks on the old wooden storage cabins behind the main lodge, when I would hit a pocket of air that smelled profoundly wrong. It wasn't the scent of pine or damp earth. It was the sharp, sour stench of old mash whiskey, chewing tobacco, and unwashed wool. It was so potent, it would make my eyes water. I'd shine my heavy flashlight into the dark, expecting to catch a trespassing camper, but the beam would only cut through empty, swirling mist. Then came the sounds. Staff housing was a row of thin-walled, tin-roofed cabins about 100 yards from the stables. Sometime in late September, I started waking up at exactly 3 a.m. to a rhythmic, metallic banging. Clack, clack, clack. It sounded like someone dragging a heavy tin cup or an iron python along the corrugated siding of the cabins. The first time I heard it, I assumed it was a loose piece of flashing banging in the mountain wind. But the rhythm was too deliberate. It was slow, mocking. I asked the other guys on the maintenance crew about it the next morning. A few of them looked away, suddenly intensely interested in their coffee. Finally, a guy named Marcus muttered, "Just ignore it. Don't look out the window when it happens. Just go back to sleep."
I didn't sleep well after that. None of us did. A heavy, unspoken paranoia began to settle over the crew. The lodge felt increasingly claustrophobic, the massive timber walls pressing in on us. Things escalated quietly. Tools didn't just go missing. They reappeared in impossible places. I once left my heavy leather work gloves on the hood of the utility tractor. 3 hours later, I found them perfectly folded inside the locked, glass-enclosed display case in the lodge lobby, right next to Silas Vance's antique hunting knife. Only the general manager had the key to that case. But the turning point, the moment the haunting stopped being a nervous joke and became a genuine threat, happened to a seasonal wrangler named Sarah. Sarah was a hardened, experienced rider. She knew horses better than she knew people. One afternoon, she was leading a small group of late-season tourists up the narrow ridge trail, a path that hugged a sheer 300-foot drop into the canyon. Halfway up the ridge, her saddle suddenly slipped entirely sideways. She barely managed to throw herself off into the dirt trail before the horse panicked. If she had fallen the other way, she would have plummeted off the cliff.
When she brought the horse back to the stables, she was shaking uncontrollably. She didn't say a word to the tourists. She just dragged me into the tack room and pointed at the heavy leather cinch of her saddle. The thick metal buckle hadn't broken. The thick leather strap hadn't snapped. It had been manually unbuckled, pulled entirely loose. "I checked my gear 3 times before we left," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I always do. It was tight. Someone loosened it. Someone wanted me to fall." That night, I found muddy boot prints in the hallway of the staff cabins. They weren't from modern hiking boots. There was no aggressive tread pattern. It was just the flat, smooth shape of a large, square-toed leather boot. The mud was thick, black, and smelled sharply of sulfur and sour whiskey. The prints led directly from the front door, stopping dead right outside Sarah's room. I didn't tell her. I just spent the night sitting in a chair by the front door with a heavy steel crowbar across my lap. The next day, I cornered Miller, the 60-year-old stable manager who had worked at Timberline for over 2 decades. He was a quiet, weathered man who usually kept to himself. I told him about the cinch. I told him about the boot prints. Miller sighed, rubbing a hand over his deeply lined face. He locked the stable office door and pulled a worn, leather-bound notebook from the bottom drawer of his desk. It wasn't an official park record. It was a collection of notes passed down from previous managers. "The park tells a nice story about Silas Vance," Miller said, his voice low, lacking any of its usual gravelly warmth. "They leave out the end of his life. The silver crash of '93 broke his mind. He grew fiercely paranoid, thought everyone who came up this mountain was trying to steal a claim he never even found. He used to lock guests in their rooms from the outside. He'd sabotage the stagecoaches so people couldn't leave. When the winter of 1906 hit, he didn't die of a fever. He died out in the snow, hunting a group of surveyors he thought were thieves. He froze to death holding a rifle." Miller looked me dead in the eyes. "Silas didn't tame this wilderness. It drove him insane. And whatever part of him is still walking around this property, it hates us. It thinks we're trespassing." By mid-October, the season was ending. The tourists were gone. The Park Service was shutting down the water lines and boarding up the windows for the harsh winter. Only 4 of us remained on the property to finish the winterization. The manager, 2 other maintenance guys, and me. We were completely alone in the valley. The final night, a massive storm system moved in from the north. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. Freezing rain lashed against the lodge, and a dense, unnatural fog rolled down the mountainside, swallowing the trees, the trails, and the outbuildings. At around 9 p.m., the generator failed. The lodge plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The wind howled through the canyons, making the heavy timber walls of the building groan and shift like the ribs of a dying animal. My radio crackled. It was the manager, his voice barely cutting through the static. "The horses are spooked. Something's wrong in the stables. I need you to go down there and secure the doors before they kick their stalls apart." I didn't want to go. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay inside the locked cabin. But I couldn't leave the animals. I grabbed a heavy, battery-powered storm lantern,
zipped up my thick canvas jacket, and stepped out into the freezing rain.
The walk to the stables was a nightmare. The beam of my lantern barely penetrated 3 feet into the swirling gray fog. The rain sounded like static in my ears, but beneath it, I could hear the frantic whinnying of the horses. They were terrified. I reached the heavy wooden sliding doors of the stable and shoved them open. Inside, the air was warm, thick, and utterly foul. The smell of wet horsehair was completely overpowered by the suffocating stench of rotting wood, chewing tobacco, and that sharp, sickening odor of sour mash whiskey. The horses were thrashing in their stalls, kicking at the thick wooden dividers. "Hey, easy!" I called out, my voice trembling. I held the lantern high, casting long, erratic shadows across the rafters. I walked down the central aisle, checking the heavy iron latches on the stall doors. As I reached the middle of the barn, the heavy sliding doors at the entrance suddenly slammed shut behind me. The boom echoed like a gunshot. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The barn went dead silent. The horses stopped thrashing instantly. It wasn't a calm silence. It was the frozen, breathless silence of prey realizing a predator is in the room.
The temperature in the barn plummeted. I could see my own breath pluming in the amber light of the lantern. Then, from the far end of the aisle, in the deepest shadows where the lantern light couldn't reach, I heard it. Clack, clack, clack. It was the metallic scraping sound, but it wasn't outside. It was inside the barn. It sounded like the heavy buckle of a horse cinch being dragged slowly along the wooden stall doors. I froze. I couldn't move my legs. The heat drained out of my body, leaving me numb and shivering. Clack, clack, clack. The sound was moving closer, slowly, deliberately. I strained my eyes against the darkness. At the edge of the light, a silhouette began to form. It wasn't a transparent, glowing ghost from a movie. It was a massive, impossibly dark mass. It looked like a man, but the proportions were wrong. The shoulders were too wide, hunched heavily forward. I could hear the heavy, wet squelch of thick leather boots pressing into the dirt floor. Squelch, drag, squelch, drag. The smell of sour alcohol became so strong, I gagged. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. I was entirely paralyzed by a primal, suffocating terror. The figure stopped just 10 feet away, hovering at the absolute edge of my lantern's reach. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a wide-brimmed, decaying hat and the bulk of a heavy, waterlogged coat. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. I could hear a slow, wet, rattling breathing coming from the dark. It sounded like someone trying to draw air through a chest full of fluid. Then, a voice broke the silence. It didn't echo, it didn't boom. It was a raw, raspy whisper that sounded entirely too close, as if the lips speaking it were resting directly against my ear. Mine. The single word vibrated in my teeth. Suddenly, the horses erupted into absolute frenzy. Wood splintered, hooves slammed against metal. In the chaos, the heavy storm lantern in my hand flickered violently, the bulb buzzing like an angry wasp, before dying completely. I was plunged into total darkness. I didn't think. I just reacted. I dropped the dead lantern, turned, and sprinted blindly toward where I knew the side exit was. I slammed into the wooden wall, my hands desperately scrambling over the rough timber until I felt the iron handle of the side door. I yanked it open, threw myself out into the freezing mud, and didn't stop running until I reached the illuminated porch of the main lodge, screaming for the manager. We left the park the next morning at first light. We didn't finish winterizing. We didn't pack everything. We just loaded the horses into the trailers and drove the winding mountain roads in complete silence. I never went back to Black Ridge Basin.
I never collected my final paycheck. I moved to a city, surrounded myself with concrete, streetlights, and the constant, comforting noise of millions of people. But the trauma of that place hasn't left me. It never will. Because even now, 4 years later, locked in my third-floor apartment in the middle of a sprawling metropolis, I still wake up, always at exactly 3 a.m. I lie in my bed, staring at the ceiling, barely breathing. And if I listen closely enough, beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic, I can smell the faint, sickening scent of sour mash whiskey. And then, from the hallway, right outside my locked bedroom door, I hear it. Clack. Clack.
Dive right in. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and comment your favorite story in the comments down below. In the late 2000s, when I was 23 and stubbornly committed to the romantic idea of being a broke expat in Berlin, I lived in a cramped flat with 2 roommates and just enough money for rent, beer, and the occasional concert ticket. It was messy and loud and perfect. One night in late October, maybe early November, my British roommate and I went to see a local band play in Kreuzberg. We left around midnight, warm from cheap beer and live music, buzzing but not drunk. The air was unusually mild for autumn, mist clinging to the street in soft halos beneath the yellow streetlights. We were laughing too loudly, arms looped together, heading toward a U-Bahn entrance at the end of a long, mostly empty street. It was central, but quiet at that hour. The kind of quiet that makes your footsteps echo. That's when we noticed her. Up ahead, half obscured by mist, was a small, stooped figure, an elderly woman from the look of it. She was walking slowly, carrying a bag in each hand, one leg dragged behind her in a pronounced limp. We were speaking English, just about to pass her, when she cried out, also in English, but thickly accented. "Oh, help! Won't somebody help me?" The tone was wrong. Not frightened, not desperate. Demanding. My roommate subtly tightened her arm around mine, trying to guide us past, but I slowed. Because what kind of person ignores an elderly woman struggling with groceries in the middle of the night? I asked what she needed. "It's my leg," she said. "Help me carry the bags. I live just over there." She nodded toward an apartment building half a block up. Her voice carried an urgency that felt rehearsed. Still, my reflexes overpowered my instincts. "Of course we'll help you," I said automatically. My roommate hesitated, but we each took a bag and walked her to the building. That's when I saw her properly under the streetlight. She looked like something lifted straight out of a grim European folktale. Bent spine, straggly gray-white hair, a large wart on her nose, deep-set eyes, dark wool clothes with a hood framing her face. It startled me, viscerally, but I scolded myself for the thought. You can't judge someone for looking like a stereotype. When we reached the building, the front door was already slightly ajar. That was the first real crack in the illusion. In that neighborhood, doors were never left open at night. She pushed it open easily, too easily, and suddenly she didn't seem frail at all. She leaned forward and held it wide, gesturing me inside. "Just up the stairs," she breathed, "just up the stairs." Her voice had changed again, softer, intent. Inside was a narrow hallway lit by weak fluorescent light. A steep staircase rose directly ahead. At the top, on the right, I could just make out a door that was also slightly open. A smell drifted down, stale, thick, like old smoke and something damp. Every hair on my arm stood up. I froze in the doorway. Logic said, it's polite to carry the bags upstairs. She's old, she needs help. But something deeper, something animal, was screaming. The hallway felt wrong. The open door upstairs felt wrong. The urgency in her whisper felt wrong. "Just up the stairs," she repeated, sharper now. And here's the strangest part. My slightly tipsy brain almost laughed. The whole thing felt so absurdly cliché. The dark stairwell, the ajar door, the witch-like old woman. It was too perfectly horror movie. And because of that, I nearly convinced myself it couldn't be dangerous. Real danger isn't that obvious, right? That's when my roommate said, very clearly, "Oh, hell no." Before I could react, she hooked her arm through mine and physically pulled me backward out of the doorway. The old woman's expression changed instantly, her face tightening, mouth twisting, not confused, not surprised, but disappointed. Actually disappointed. She called after us, her voice sharp and angry now as my roommate dragged me down the street. We crossed without looking and bolted into the brightly lit U-Bahn station, the sudden presence of strangers and fluorescent lighting washing over us like sanctuary. Only once we were on the platform did I realize my hands were shaking. My roommate looked at me and said, "Did you not see that?" "See what?" I asked. "Her limp," she said. "It wasn't there at first. I'm sure of it. She was walking normally until she knew we were close enough." I replayed it in my head. The mist, the dragging foot. Had it started before she called out? Or after? Then she added, very matter-of-factly, "And when you stood in that doorway, I suddenly knew there was someone at the top of those stairs. A man, waiting. I don't know how I knew, I just did." A creepy adult son, a partner, someone bigger, someone silent behind that half-open door, waiting for the polite girl who didn't want to be rude. We never reported it. We had no proof of anything. Maybe she really was just an old woman. Maybe we overreacted. But I've walked through that neighborhood since, years later, and I've never again seen a building door propped open like that. Not once. What unsettles me most isn't what might have been upstairs. It's how close I came to walking into it. I wasn't pressured, I wasn't threatened, I wasn't forced. I was invited. All it would have taken was one polite step over the threshold. And sometimes, when I think about how easily I could have ignored that feeling in my gut, I realize something chilling. If my roommate hadn't been there, I would have gone just up the stairs.